Today we're going to be reading Magic Treehouse number 1, Dinosaurs Before Dark by Mary Pope Osborne. Chapter 1, Into the Woods. Help! A monster, said Annie. Yeah, sure, said Jack. A real monster in Frog Creek, Pennsylvania. Run, Jack, said Annie. She ran up the road. Oh, brother, this is what he got for spending time with his 7-year-old sister. Annie loved pretend stuff, but Jack was 8 and a half. He liked real things. Watch out, Jack, the monster's coming. Race you. No thanks, said Jack. Annie raced alone into the woods. Jack looked at the sky. The sun was about to set. Come on, Annie, it's time to go home. But Annie had disappeared. Jack waited. No Annie. Annie, he shouted. Jack, Jack, come here. Jack groaned. This better be good, he said. Jack left the road and headed into the woods. The trees were lit with a golden late afternoon light. Come here, called Annie. There she was, standing under a tall oak tree. Look, she said. She was pointing at a rope ladder. The longest rope ladder Jack had ever seen. Wow, he whispered. The rope ladder went all the way up to the top of the tree. There, at the top, was a tree house. It was tucked between 2 branches. That must be the highest tree house in the world, said Annie. Who built it? Asked Jack. I've never seen it before. I don't know, but I'm going up, said Annie. No, we don't know who it belongs to, said Jack. Just for a teeny minute, said Annie. She started up the ladder. Annie, come back. She kept climbing. Jack sighed. Annie, it's almost dark. We have to go home. Annie disappeared inside the treehouse. Annie! Jack waited a moment. He was about to call again when Annie poked her head out of the treehouse window. Books, she shouted. What? It's filled with books. Oh, man, Jack loved books. He pushed his glasses into place. He gripped the sides of the rope ladder, and up he went. Chapter 2, The Monster. Jack crawled through a hole in the treehouse floor. Wow, the treehouse was filled with books, books everywhere. Very old books with dusty covers, new books with shiny, bright covers. Look, you can see far, far away, said Annie. She was peering out the treehouse window. Jack looked out the window with her. Down below were the tops of the other trees. In the distance, he saw the Frog Creek Library, the elementary school, the park. Annie pointed in the other direction. There's our house, she said. Sure enough, there was their white wooden house with the green porch. Next door was their neighbor's black dog, Henry. He looked very tiny. Hi, Henry, shouted Annie. Shh, said Jack. We're not supposed to be up here. He glanced around the treehouse again. I wonder who owns all of these books, he said. He noticed bookmarks were sticking out of many of them. I like this one, said Annie. She held up a book with a castle on the cover. Here's a book about Pennsylvania, said Jack. He turned to the book with a bookmark. Hey, there's a picture of Frog Creek in here, he said. It's a picture of these woods. Oh, here's a book for you, said Annie. She held up a book about dinosaurs. A blue silk bookmark was sticking out of it. Let me see it. Jack sat down his backpack and grabbed the book from her. You look at that one. I'll look at the one about castles, said Annie. No, we better not, said Jack. We don't know who these books belong to. But even as he said this, Jack opened the dinosaur book to where the bookmark was. He couldn't help himself. He turned to a picture of an ancient flying reptile, a pterodon. He touched the huge bat-like wings. Wow, whispered Jack. I wish I could see a pterodon for real. Jack studied the picture of the odd-looking creature soaring through the sky. Ah, screamed Annie. What, said Jack. A monster, Annie cried. She pointed to the treehouse window. Stop pretending, Annie, said Jack. No, really, said Annie. Jack looked out the window. A giant creature was gliding above the treetops. He had a long, weird crest on the back of his head, a shiny beak, and huge bat-like wings. It was a real, live pterodon. The creature curved through the sky. He was coming straight toward the treehouse. He looked like a glider plane. The wind began to blow. The leaves trembled. Suddenly, the creature soared up, high into the sky. Jack nearly fell out of the window trying to see it. The wind picked up. It was whistling now. The treehouse started to spin. What's happening? Cried Jack. Get down, shouted Annie. She pulled him back from the window. The treehouse was spinning faster and faster. Jack squeezed his eyes shut. He held on to Annie. Then everything was still, absolutely still. Jack opened his eyes. Sunlight slanted through the window. There was Annie, the books, his backpack. The treehouse was still high up in an oak tree, but it wasn't the same oak tree. So let's pause for just a minute. What do we know so far? So let's think, who is in the story? So we have Jack and Annie. Jack is 8 and a half, we learned. He's the older brother, and Annie's 7. She's a little sister. They're walking home, right? That's what was happening. And then as they were walking home, Annie was pretending there was a monster. So she ran into the woods, right? And then that's when she spotted the treehouse that they went up. So we learned with that Annie's a little bit more curious and just kind of charges in. Jack's a little bit more cautious. What do we know about the setting? So it said that the woods they were in were the Frog Creek Woods in Pennsylvania. But it sounds like there's a dinosaur now and that maybe the treehouse was spinning. So maybe there's a new setting. Let's find out. Chapter 3, Where is Here? Jack looked out the window. He looked down at the picture in the book. He looked back out the window. The world outside and the world in the picture, they were exactly the same. The pterodon was soaring through the sky. The ground was covered with ferns and tall grass. There was a winding stream, a sloping hill, and volcanoes in the distance. Where are we? Stammered Jack. The pterodon glided down to the base of their tree. The creature coasted to a stop and stood very still. What happened to us? Said Annie. She looked at Jack. He looked at her. I don't know, said Jack. I was looking at the picture in the book, and you said, wow, I wish I could see a pterodon for real, said Annie. Yeah. And then we saw one in the Frog Creek Woods, said Jack. Yeah. And then the wind got loud, and the treehouse started spinning, said Annie. And we landed here, said Jack. And we landed here, said Annie. So that means, said Jack. So that means what? Said Annie. Nothing, said Jack. He shook his head. None of this can be real. Annie looked out of the window again. But he's real, she said. He's very real. Jack looked out of the window with her. The pterodon was standing at the base of the oak tree like a guard. His giant wings were spread out on either side of him. Hi, Annie shouted. Shh, said Jack. We're not supposed to be here. But where is here? Said Annie. I don't know, said Jack. Hi, Annie called to the creature. The pterodon looked up at them. Where is here? Annie called down. You're nuts. He can't talk, said Jack. But maybe the book could tell us. Jack looked down at the book. He read the words under the picture. This flying reptile lived in the Cretaceous period. It vanished 65 million years ago. No, impossible. They couldn't have landed in a time 65 million years ago. Jack said, Annie, he's nice. Nice? Yeah, I can tell. Let's go down and talk to him. Talk to him? Annie started down the rope ladder. Hey, shouted Jack, but Annie kept going. Are you crazy? Jack called. Annie dropped to the ground. She stepped boldly up to the ancient creature. Jack gasped. Oh, chapter 4, Henry. Annie held out her hand. Oh, brother. She was always trying to make friends with animals, but this was going too far. Don't get too close to him, Annie, Jack shouted. But Annie touched the pterodon's crest. She stroked his neck. She was talking to him. What in the world was she saying? Jack took a deep breath. Okay, he would go down too. It would be good to examine the creature. Take notes, like a scientist. Jack started down the rope ladder. Then, when he got to the ground, Jack was only a few feet away from the creature. The creature stared at Jack. His eyes were bright and alert. He's soft, Jack, said Annie. He feels like Henry. Jack snorted. He's no dog, Annie. Feel him, Jack, said Annie. Jack didn't move. Don't think, Jack. Just do it. Jack stepped forward. He put out his arm very cautiously. He brushed his hand down the creature's neck. Interesting. A thin layer of fuzz covered the pterodon's skin. Soft, huh, said Annie. Jack reached into his backpack and pulled out a pencil and a notebook. He wrote, fuzzy skin. What are you doing? Asked Annie. Taking notes, said Jack. We're probably the first people in the whole world to ever see a real live pterodon. Jack looked at the pterodon again. The creature had a bony crest on the top of his head. The crest was longer than Jack's arm. I wonder how smart he is, Jack said. Very smart, said Annie. Don't count on it, said Jack. His brain's probably no bigger than a pea. No, he's very smart. I can feel it, said Annie. I'm going to call him Henry. Jack wrote in his notebook. Small brain, question mark. Jack looked at the creature again. Maybe he's a mutant, he said. The creature tilted his head. Annie laughed. He's no mutant, Jack. Well, what's he doing here then? Where is this place? Said Jack. Annie leaned close to the pterodon. Do you know where we are, Henry? She asked softly. The creature fixed his eyes on Annie. His long jaws were opening and closing like a giant pair of scissors. Are you trying to talk to me, Henry? Asked Annie. Forget it, Annie, Jack wrote in his notebook. Mouth like scissors, question mark. Did we come to a time long ago, Henry? Asked Annie. Is this the place from long ago? Suddenly she gasped. Jack! He looked up. Annie was pointing toward the hill. On top stood a huge dinosaur. Chapter 4, Gold in the Grass. Go, go, said Jack. He threw his notebook into his pack. He pushed Annie toward the rope ladder. Bye, Henry, she said. Go, said Jack. He gave Annie a big push. Quit it, she said. But she started up the ladder. Jack scrambled after her. They tumbled into the treehouse. They were panting as they looked out the window at the dinosaur. He was standing on the hilltop, eating flowers off a tree. Oh, man, whispered Jack. We are in a time long ago. The dinosaur looked like a huge rhinoceros. Only he had 3 horns instead of 1, 2 long ones above his eyes and 1 on his nose. He had a big shield thing behind his head. Triceratops, said Jack. Does he eat people? Whispered Annie. I'll look it up. Jack grabbed the dinosaur book. He flipped through the pages. There, he said. He pointed to a picture of a triceratops. He read the caption. The triceratops lived in the late Cretaceous period. This plant-eating dinosaur weighed over 12,000 pounds. Jack slammed the book shut. Just plants, no meat. Let's go see him, said Annie. Are you nuts, said Jack. Don't you want to take notes about him, asked Annie. We're probably the first people in the whole world to ever see a real live triceratops. Jack sighed. She was right. Let's go, he said. He shoved the dinosaur book into his pack. He slung it over his shoulder and started down the ladder. On the way down, Jack stopped. He called up to Annie. Just promise you won't pet him. I promise. Promise you won't kiss him. I promise. Promise you won't talk to him. I promise. Promise you won't. Go, she said. Jack went. Annie followed. When they stepped off the ladder, the pterodon gave them a kind look. Annie blew a kiss at him. Be back soon, Henry, she said cheerfully. Shush, said Jack. And he led the way through the ferns, slowly and carefully. When he reached the bottom of the hill, he kneeled behind a fat bush. Annie knelt beside him and started to speak. Shh! Jack put his fingers to his lips. Annie made a face. Jack peeked out at the triceratops. The dinosaur was incredibly big, bigger than a truck. He was eating the flowers off a magnolia tree. Jack slipped his notebook out of his pack. He wrote, Eats flowers. Annie nudged him. Jack ignored her. He studied the triceratops again. He wrote, Eat slowly. Annie nudged him hard. Jack looked at her. Annie pointed to herself. She walked her fingers through the air. She pointed to the dinosaur. She smiled. Was she teasing? She waved at Jack. Jack started to grab her. She laughed and jumped away. She fell into the grass in full view of the triceratops. Get back, whispered Jack. Too late. The big dinosaur had spotted Annie. He gazed down at her from the hilltop. Half of a magnolia flower was sticking out of his mouth. Oops, said Annie. Get back, Jack shouted at her. He looks nice, Jack. Nice? Watch out for his big horns, Annie. No, he's nice, Jack. Nice? But the triceratops just gazed calmly down at Annie. Then he turned and loped away down the side of the hill. Bye, said Annie. She turned back to Jack. See? Jack grunted, but he wrote in his notebook. Nice. Come on, let's look around some more, said Annie. As Jack started after Annie, he saw something glittering in the tall grass. He reached out and picked it up, a medallion, a gold medallion. A letter was engraved on the medallion, a fancy M. Oh, man, someone came here before us, Jack said softly. Okay, so what do we know in our book so far? Let's review. So we have Jack and Annie. Those are our characters still, right? So they are in a land long ago in the time of dinosaurs. They've met a pterodon and a triceratops, right? What else happened? We know now that Annie is very curious and doesn't think first. She just does stuff, and that she can somehow communicate with animals. We learned that. We learned that Jack likes to do his research and that he likes to take notes and that he's a little bit more reserved and he wants to study things out before he acts. He's kind of the protector of Annie and looks out for her. Let's see, what else have we learned about the story? What can you think of? There's an M that he found in the grass, a gold medallion. That seems kind of random, don't you think? If the author ever puts some random thing in their story, usually that's a clue. Remember, we've talked about being detectives as we read. It can be a clue as to what is going to come later. It's called foreshadowing. And as we read books, the author will kind of leave us clues, a little trail that we can follow so that we stay interested and excited about what's happening in the story, and it gives us hints as to what's to come. Next time, we will find out what happens in our dinosaur adventure.